Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was born on February 12, 1809, in a modest log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His birth took place in a time of great hardship and uncertainty for many American families, particularly those living on the frontier. The land surrounding Lincoln's birthplace was untamed and difficult to farm, a characteristic that would shape much of his early life. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, were pioneers seeking to carve out a living in the wilderness. Lincoln's early years, marked by poverty and instability, would instill in him values of resilience, hard work, and the importance of self-reliance. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a man of limited education and resources. He struggled to provide for his family, moving them frequently in search of better opportunities. In 1811, when Abraham was just 2 years old, the family moved to the frontier of Indiana, where they lived in a one-room cabin in the wilderness. The harshness of the land and the uncertainty of their future weighed heavily on the young Lincoln. By the time he was 7, his mother, Nancy, passed away, leaving a profound emotional void in his life. His mother's death, caused by milk sickness, marked the first of many personal tragedies that would shape Lincoln's character. Nancy Hanks Lincoln had been a significant influence on young Abraham. She was known for her kindness, intelligence, and the strong moral compass she instilled in her children. Lincoln often recalled his mother as an essential figure in his upbringing, and it was her death that instilled a deep sense of loss in him. His father, while hardworking, was not able to provide the same emotional warmth or guidance that Nancy had given. As a result, Lincoln's early years were marked by a sense of emotional isolation and a longing for the maternal care he had lost. After Nancy's death, Thomas remarried in 1819 to Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah Bush Johnston was a kind and nurturing stepmother, and she quickly formed a close bond with Abraham. She recognized his intellectual curiosity and encouraged his love for reading. Unlike his biological mother, Sarah provided Abraham with the support and care that allowed him to thrive, particularly in his education. This new maternal influence had a lasting impact on Lincoln, offering him the emotional stability he had long lacked. Growing up in a family that struggled financially, Lincoln's access to formal education was limited. He attended school intermittently, often for only a few months at a time, but his thirst for knowledge remained insatiable. Despite the scarcity of books and materials, Lincoln would often walk long distances to borrow books and study on his own. His formal schooling was minimal, but his self-education would prove to be one of the defining features of his life. His early reading, particularly works of law, literature, and history, laid the foundation for his intellectual development and future career. Lincoln's humble beginnings were not marked by any immediate signs of greatness, but rather by a series of ordinary struggles that many Americans could relate to. His childhood was filled with hard physical labor, including tasks such as splitting logs and clearing land. These chores, though grueling, contributed to his physical strength and work ethic. Lincoln often spoke of how these formative years, spent toiling on the land, shaped his character and instilled in him a deep respect for the value of hard work. This connection to the land and its challenges would also shape his political views on issues like slavery, land ownership, and economic fairness. Despite the hardships he faced, Lincoln demonstrated a remarkable ability to overcome adversity. As a young boy, he began to develop a reputation for being a hard worker and a natural leader. His peers and elders often recognized his intelligence, and he became known for his ability to deliver persuasive speeches and arguments. Though he had limited schooling, his ability to articulate ideas and reason through complex issues was apparent from an early age. This early interest in debating and discussing ideas would set the stage for his future career in law and politics. As Lincoln matured, he began to recognize the limitations imposed by his poverty and lack of formal education. Nevertheless, he persisted in his studies and sought out any opportunity to expand his knowledge. His early adulthood was characterized by a variety of jobs that ranged from working as a rail splitter to serving as a storekeeper, surveyor, and postmaster. Each of these positions contributed to his understanding of human nature, business, and the intricacies of American society. These experiences not only shaped his worldview, but also provided him with the skills needed to interact with a wide array of individuals from different walks of life. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21 years old, his family moved again, this time to Illinois. The move to Illinois marked another chapter in Lincoln's early life. By this time, Lincoln was beginning to forge his own path, distinct from the path his father had laid out for him. Although his family continued to struggle, Abraham began to chart a course toward independence. His desire to make something of himself, combined with the moral lessons imparted by his mother and stepmother, propelled him forward in his personal and professional development. As he settled in New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln began to build the foundation for his future career in law and politics. The formative experiences of Lincoln's early life, his struggles with poverty, loss, hard work, and self-education, were all crucial in shaping his character and worldview. These experiences fostered a deep sense of empathy for the common man, as well as a belief in the power of perseverance. Lincoln's early life was far from ideal. It was these challenges that would mold him into the determined, self-reliant individual who would one day lead the nation through its greatest crisis. His humble beginnings were not an obstacle, but rather the very crucible that would forge his extraordinary leadership abilities. Abraham Lincoln's early life was marked by a stark contrast between the limited educational opportunities available to him and his boundless desire for knowledge. While his formal schooling was brief and irregular, Lincoln's self-driven education would become one of the most significant aspects of his development. From a young age, he demonstrated an exceptional thirst for learning, and this passion for knowledge would shape his future career as both a lawyer and a politician. In many ways, Lincoln's educational journey was a testament to the power of perseverance and self-improvement as he sought to overcome the limitations imposed by his humble beginnings. Lincoln's childhood in the frontier was far from conducive to formal education. His family moved frequently, and the demands of frontier life left little room for regular schooling. In his early years, he attended sporadic classes that were typically held in log cabins with limited resources. His teachers were often inexperienced, and the curriculum, if there was one, was basic. Yet, despite these challenges, Lincoln's insatiable curiosity led him to teach himself whenever possible. He learned to read at an early age, and books became his most treasured possessions. Even though he had access to only a few books, including the Bible, Aesop's fables, and other works of moral instruction, Lincoln devoured them with fervor. The Bible, in particular, played a central role in Lincoln's intellectual formation. Its stories, teachings, and moral lessons resonated deeply with him and were a constant presence in his life. Lincoln's early exposure to biblical texts provided him not only with spiritual guidance, but also with a model of language and rhetoric. His mastery of the Bible's language later became one of his defining traits, influencing the eloquence of his speeches and written works. Although Lincoln was not a religious zealot, he found in the Bible a rich source of wisdom that guided his moral compass and shaped his understanding of right and wrong. Beyond the Bible, Lincoln's hunger for knowledge led him to explore a wide range of subjects, including law, history, and literature. At the age of 21, Lincoln moved with his family to Illinois, where he began to seriously pursue self-education. He worked various jobs, including as a rail splitter, storekeeper, and postmaster, but always found time to read and study. With limited access to formal educational institutions, Lincoln relied on borrowed books, often walking miles to obtain them. His reading was eclectic, covering a variety of topics that reflected his growing intellectual interests. His ability to digest complex material, from works of classical literature to political treatises, was a testament to his remarkable intellectual capacity. Lincoln's desire for education was not only fueled by a love of learning, but also by a deep sense of ambition. He recognized that in order to rise above the poverty and limited opportunities of his early life, he needed to acquire skills that would allow him to succeed in the competitive world of law and politics. Lincoln's decision to study law, despite not having formal legal education, highlights his self-discipline and determination. He began by reading legal texts and studying the works of influential lawyers and legal philosophers. This independent study laid the foundation for his later success as a self-taught lawyer. The legal profession, with its emphasis on logic, argumentation, and persuasion, suited Lincoln's intellectual inclinations. His ability to read, analyze, and distill complex ideas into clear, persuasive language became one of his greatest strengths. By 1836, Lincoln had passed the Illinois bar exam and became a practicing lawyer in Springfield, Illinois. His legal practice, while modest in its early years, allowed him to develop skills that would later prove invaluable in his political career. As a lawyer, Lincoln honed his ability to connect with ordinary people, understand their struggles, and communicate his ideas effectively. These qualities would become central to his political identity. In addition to his legal career, Lincoln's early years in Springfield also marked the beginning of his political aspirations. He was drawn to the Whig Party, which championed economic development, internal improvements, and a strong national government. Lincoln's political views were shaped by his understanding of the economic and social issues facing the nation, particularly the expansion of slavery and its moral and economic implications. He recognized that the United States was at a crossroads, and his education, both formal and informal, allowed him to see the broader implications of these issues. His self-improvement efforts were not only aimed at personal advancement, but also at understanding the complex political landscape in which he would soon become a key player. Lincoln's engagement with political ideas was informed by the debates and issues of his time. He was deeply influenced by the writings of political thinkers such as Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and other leading figures of the Whig Party. Lincoln admired Clay's emphasis on the American system, which promoted economic development through protective tariffs, infrastructure projects, and a national bank. He believed that a strong national economy was essential for the well-being of the United States, and he advocated for policies that would foster growth and stability. This pragmatic, solution-oriented approach to governance would define Lincoln's leadership style throughout his political career. Throughout his journey of self-education, Lincoln also developed a profound respect for the power of speech and rhetoric. He recognized that the ability to communicate effectively was essential to influencing public opinion and shaping policy. Lincoln's speeches, from his early days as a Whig politician to his later presidential addresses, were marked by clarity, logic, and emotional resonance. He understood that in order to connect with the American people, he needed to speak in a way that was accessible and relatable, while also inspiring confidence in his leadership. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas during the Illinois Senate race of 1858 are a prime example of his rhetorical prowess. Lincoln's ability to craft compelling arguments and address the moral and political issues of the day helped him gain national attention and cemented his place as one of the leading voices in American politics. Lincoln's self-education also extended to his understanding of human nature. His years as a lawyer, interacting with a diverse range of people, allowed him to develop a keen sense of empathy and understanding. He often said that his experiences as a lawyer, particularly his work in rural Illinois, taught him how to connect with people from all walks of life. This ability to empathize with others, to understand their struggles and concerns, would become a hallmark of his leadership as president. It was through these formative years of self-education and personal growth that Lincoln developed the moral clarity and intellectual depth that would guide him through the challenges of the presidency. Abraham Lincoln's entry into politics was not the result of a single event, but rather the culmination of a series of gradual steps that reflected both his intellectual development and his growing desire to influence the course of his country. Having established himself as a self-taught lawyer, Lincoln's ambition extended beyond the courtroom. He recognized early on that in order to create meaningful change, he would need to engage in the political process. His entry into the Illinois state legislature in 1834 marked the beginning of his political career, and it would lay the foundation for his later rise to national prominence. Lincoln's experience in the state legislature exposed him to the practicalities of governance and honed his ability to navigate the complex terrain of political negotiation. In the early 1830s, Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he quickly became involved in local political life. The Whig Party, which at the time was the principal opposition to the Democratic Party in the United States, appealed to Lincoln's sense of ambition and desire for national development. The Whigs championed policies that promoted internal improvements such as roads, canals, and railroads, as well as protective tariffs and a national bank. Lincoln, with his background in law and his intellectual inclination toward economic development, found these ideas compelling. The Whig Party's emphasis on strengthening the federal government and supporting infrastructure projects aligned with his vision for a more united and prosperous nation. Lincoln's political journey began in 1832, when, at the age of 23, he ran for the Illinois state legislature for the first time. Though he lost that election, his campaign was not in vain. He gained valuable experience in public speaking and political campaigning, which would serve him well in his future endeavors. His speeches during this time were marked by their earnestness and clarity, and they reflected his growing belief in the importance of political participation as a means of effecting social change. Despite his loss, Lincoln's determination and eloquence caught the attention of local political figures, laying the groundwork for his future success. In 1834, Lincoln ran again for the Illinois state legislature, this time winning a seat. His victory marked the beginning of his political career, and his time in the state legislature provided him with an opportunity to develop his political philosophy and gain insight into the workings of government. During his time as a legislator, Lincoln became known for his honesty, his ability to communicate effectively, and his commitment to public service. He was not a man driven by ambition for personal gain, but rather by a desire to serve the public and improve the lives of his constituents. His integrity and commitment to the ideals of the Whig Party earned him respect among his peers, even those who did not agree with him politically. One of the most significant aspects of Lincoln's time in the Illinois state legislature was his growing involvement in debates over slavery and the expansion of slavery into new territories. While the issue of slavery was not yet the central focus of national politics in the 1830s, Lincoln's views on the matter were beginning to take shape. He was initially more focused on issues related to economic development and infrastructure, but as he interacted with other legislators and began to grapple with the moral and political complexities of the nation's future, slavery became a topic of increasing concern. Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery was rooted in his belief that slavery was morally wrong and a threat to the nation's democratic ideals. Lincoln's time in the Illinois state legislature also allowed him to build important relationships with key political figures. One such relationship was with Stephen A. Douglas, who would become one of Lincoln's most significant political rivals. Douglas, a member of the Democratic Party, was an advocate for popular sovereignty, which allowed territories to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery. Lincoln, on the other hand, believed that slavery should not be allowed to expand into new territories. The intellectual and political rivalry between Lincoln and Douglas would come to a head in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, but their first encounters in the state legislature provided the foundation for this ongoing conflict. In addition to his work on issues related to slavery, Lincoln became increasingly interested in the development of Illinois and the broader nation. His commitment to economic progress was evident in his support for internal improvements, such as railroads and canals, that would facilitate trade and expand the reach of American commerce. Lincoln's support for these initiatives was not just driven by economic considerations, but also by a belief in the importance of national unity. The construction of infrastructure projects, such as roads and railways, was seen as a way to connect the diverse regions of the country and strengthen the Union. This focus on unity would become a central theme of Lincoln's presidency, particularly as the nation approached the brink of civil war. Lincoln's time in the Illinois state legislature also marked the beginning of his interest in national politics. He became increasingly aware of the ways in which local and state issues were connected to broader national concerns. His growing understanding of the political landscape of the United States was crucial to his development as a political figure. As he honed his skills in the legislature, Lincoln began to see the necessity of engaging in national debates about issues such as slavery, the expansion of the nation's territory, and the role of the federal government. It was in the Illinois state legislature that Lincoln's commitment to the principles of democracy and liberty began to take on a more national dimension. Throughout his time in the Illinois state legislature, Lincoln was not just learning the ropes of politics, but also developing a deeper sense of his moral convictions. His belief in the importance of preserving the Union and the necessity of confronting the issue of slavery was becoming more pronounced. Lincoln was increasingly aware that the nation's future was tied to its ability to address the moral and political issues that divided it. His tenure in the legislature helped to solidify his commitment to the idea that the United States could not continue to exist as a nation divided over the issue of slavery. This realization would guide his actions in the years to come. The Illinois state legislature also provided Lincoln with the opportunity to further refine his ability to communicate his ideas. His speeches and debates in the legislature helped him develop a clear, persuasive style of communication that would become one of his defining traits as a politician. Lincoln's speeches were not marked by lofty rhetoric or grandiose statements, but by a straightforward, common-sense approach to issues. His ability to connect with ordinary people and communicate complex ideas in a way that was both accessible and compelling became one of his greatest strengths as he moved toward higher political office. The years following Abraham Lincoln's tenure in the Illinois state legislature marked a pivotal period in his political evolution. By the mid-1850s, Lincoln had established himself as an able lawyer and an articulate advocate for Whig Party ideals. Yet he had not yet attained national prominence. However, his political trajectory would dramatically shift with his involvement in the Illinois Senate race of 1858, where he faced off against the incumbent Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, a series of 7 public debates held across Illinois, would become the crucible through which Lincoln's political philosophy and moral convictions would be tested, allowing him to solidify his place in American history. The debates were not just a contest between two politicians. They were a national spectacle that highlighted the ideological divide over slavery, a divide that would ultimately lead the nation into civil war. At the heart of the Lincoln-Douglas debates was the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. The nation had long been divided on this issue, with southern states advocating for the spread of slavery and northern states increasingly opposed to its expansion. Stephen A. Douglas, a prominent Democratic senator, was a staunch advocate of popular sovereignty, the idea that the residents of a territory should be able to decide for themselves whether slavery would be permitted. Douglas's position was grounded in his belief in states' rights and his desire to preserve the Union by allowing territories to determine their own fate. His position was a reflection of the Democratic Party's efforts to avoid taking a strong stand on slavery, hoping instead to appease both the North and the South by leaving the decision to local populations. In contrast, Lincoln's position was clear. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, though he did not advocate for immediate abolition in states where slavery already existed. His moral opposition to slavery was rooted in his belief that it was an immoral institution, but he also understood the complex political realities surrounding its existence in the southern states. Lincoln argued that while the federal government had no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery in existing states, it had a responsibility to prevent the spread of slavery into new territories and states. This, in Lincoln's view, was essential to preserving the nation's moral integrity and ensuring that the nation's founding principles of liberty and equality were upheld. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas became a microcosm of the broader national debate over slavery and its future in the United States. Over the course of the 7 debates, Lincoln and Douglas each presented their arguments to large crowds across Illinois. Lincoln's speeches were marked by a moral clarity that resonated with many in the North. He spoke eloquently about the moral stain of slavery and its inherent injustice. At the same time, he argued that the nation could not remain half slave and half free without facing the consequences of division. Lincoln's rhetorical skills were put to the test during these debates, and he emerged as a forceful advocate for the abolition of slavery's expansion, laying the groundwork for his future national campaign. Douglas, on the other hand, emphasized his commitment to preserving the Union and defending the rights of states to determine their own laws. He argued that the federal government should not interfere in the internal affairs of the states, including the issue of slavery. While Douglas's arguments were appealing to many in the South and to those in the North who sought compromise, Lincoln's moral opposition to the expansion of slavery offered a stark contrast. Douglas's emphasis on popular sovereignty, Lincoln argued, was simply a way to avoid confronting the central moral issue of slavery and its consequences for the nation. Lincoln's challenge to Douglas was not just a political disagreement. It was a moral indictment of the system of slavery itself. One of the most significant moments of the debates came when Lincoln asked Douglas the now famous Freeport Doctrine question. Lincoln pressed Douglas on whether, under the principle of popular sovereignty, a territory could legally exclude slavery before it became a state. Douglas's response was that, in his view, territories could indeed prevent the establishment of slavery by not passing laws to protect it. This statement, while meant to reaffirm Douglas's belief in popular sovereignty, angered Southern slaveholders who saw it as a threat to their interests. The Freeport Doctrine became a key issue in the debates, as it revealed the deeper tensions within the Democratic Party and exposed the inability of popular sovereignty to provide a lasting solution to the slavery question. Although Lincoln did not win the Senate seat in 1858, Douglas retained his position. The debates significantly boosted Lincoln's profile. The debates were widely covered by the press, and Lincoln's position on slavery resonated with many in the northern states. His moral opposition to the expansion of slavery, combined with his articulate defense of American principles, made him a compelling figure in the national political scene. In many ways, the debates were a turning point in Lincoln's career, marking his transition from a local politician in Illinois to a leader with national aspirations. They also signaled the increasing polarization of the nation over the issue of slavery, a division that would only deepen in the years to come. The Lincoln-Douglas debates also revealed the complex political landscape of the time. While Lincoln was unequivocal in his opposition to the expansion of slavery, he did not advocate for immediate abolition in the southern states, which was a position that would later become central to his presidency. At the time of the debates, Lincoln's primary goal was to prevent the further spread of slavery into the Western territories, believing that this would eventually lead to the institution's natural demise. However, his opposition to the expansion of slavery and his advocacy for preserving the Union earned him the ire of Southern leaders and set the stage for his eventual election to the presidency. In the aftermath of the debates, Lincoln's political career gained national momentum. His clear stance on slavery, his eloquent speeches, and his ability to engage in intelligent, principled debate with Douglas resonated with Northern voters who were increasingly concerned about the moral implications of slavery. Lincoln's political success in the debates helped him secure the Republican nomination for president in 1860. His ability to navigate the complex issue of slavery while appealing to a broad base of Northern voters made him a formidable candidate in the presidential election. By the time the presidential election of 1860 came around, Abraham Lincoln had firmly established himself as one of the leading voices in American politics. His clear stance against the expansion of slavery, along with his moral conviction and political acumen, had earned him national recognition. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 had thrust him into the national spotlight, and while he had not won the Illinois Senate seat, he had captured the attention of the growing Republican Party, which was increasingly dedicated to opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories. The 1860 election would prove to be a pivotal moment in the history of the United States, as it marked the beginning of Lincoln's presidency and set the stage for the impending Civil War. The Republican Party, formed in the 1850s as a coalition of anti-slavery Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, quickly became the dominant political force in the northern states. By 1860, the party had coalesced around Lincoln, who represented a moderate and pragmatic approach to the slavery question. Lincoln's appeal to Northern voters was rooted in his belief in the importance of preserving the Union, preventing the expansion of slavery, and promoting economic growth through infrastructure development. Unlike many of the more radical abolitionists, Lincoln did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery, but instead focused on stopping its spread into new territories and states. His approach was more palatable to a broad range of Northern voters, from moderate Republicans to those who were uneasy about the social upheaval that full emancipation might bring. The Democratic Party, in contrast, was deeply divided by the issue of slavery. In the South, many Democrats were staunch supporters of slavery and believed in the constitutional right to expand the institution into new territories. In the North, however, the Democratic Party had more moderate factions that were opposed to the spread of slavery, but did not support full abolition. This division within the Democratic Party would prove to be one of the key factors in Lincoln's rise to power. The party split into two factions at the Democratic National Convention of 1860. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge, a strong supporter of slavery, while Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, who advocated for popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should decide for itself whether to permit slavery. The fragmentation of the Democratic Party created a path for Lincoln to secure the Republican nomination and ultimately win the presidency. Lincoln's path to the Republican nomination was not without its challenges. The party was still relatively young and had not yet fully solidified its position on a variety of issues. Some of Lincoln's rivals within the party, such as William H. Seward and Salmon P. Chase, had more experience in national politics and were well-known figures. However, Lincoln's combination of political moderation, eloquence, and pragmatism won him the support of key party leaders. At the Republican National Convention of 1860, Lincoln's message of preserving the Union and preventing the spread of slavery resonated with the delegates, and he secured the nomination on the third ballot. His victory at the convention was a testament to his ability to unite various factions within the Republican Party, from moderate anti-slavery advocates to those who were more focused on economic development and national unity. As the campaign for the presidency heated up, Lincoln's opponents on both sides of the political spectrum sought to undermine his candidacy. The Democrats, still deeply divided, attempted to present Lincoln as an extremist who would destroy the Union by interfering with slavery. In the South, many feared that Lincoln's election would lead to the abolition of slavery, and they warned of secession if he won. The Southern states, where slavery was deeply entrenched in the economy and society, viewed Lincoln as a direct threat to their way of life. On the other hand, some Northern Democrats sought to portray Lincoln as too moderate, accusing him of not being fully committed to the abolition of slavery. Despite these attacks, Lincoln remained steadfast in his position, arguing that his primary goal was to preserve the Union and prevent the further expansion of slavery, rather than pursuing immediate emancipation. The election itself was highly contentious and reflected the deepening sectional divide in the country. Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most Southern states, where his opposition to the expansion of slavery made him a pariah. In the Northern states, however, Lincoln's message resonated strongly with voters who were increasingly disillusioned with the failure of the Democratic Party to address the issue of slavery and its expansion. As a result, Lincoln was able to secure a commanding victory in the Northern states, winning all but 3 of the free states in the Union. His total of 180 electoral votes was more than enough to secure the presidency, despite the fact that he only received around 40% of the popular vote. This split in the popular vote was reflective of the deep sectional divisions within the country, with the South overwhelmingly opposed to Lincoln's election and the North firmly behind him. Lincoln's victory in the 1860 election was a decisive moment in the nation's history. The election results underscored the growing divide between the North and the South, with the Southern states increasingly isolated in their defense of slavery. Lincoln's presidency represented a repudiation of the South's demands for the expansion of slavery, and many in the South feared that this would lead to the destruction of their social and economic system. In response to Lincoln's election, Southern states began to secede from the Union, beginning with South Carolina in December 1860. The secession crisis would escalate in the months following Lincoln's inauguration, as the Southern states formed the Confederate States of America and prepared for war. Despite the secession of Southern states, Lincoln's victory was seen as a triumph of the principles of liberty and national unity. His message during the campaign had emphasized the need to preserve the Union and protect the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. In his inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1861, Lincoln sought to calm the fears of the South while reaffirming his commitment to preventing the spread of slavery. He made it clear that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, but he firmly rejected the idea of allowing it to expand into new territories. Lincoln's words were conciliatory yet firm, signaling his belief in the Union's preservation as paramount. Lincoln's election was a turning point in American history, as it marked the beginning of a long and bloody conflict. The Civil War, which would erupt just months after Lincoln's inauguration, would test the resolve of the nation and challenge its fundamental values. Lincoln's leadership would be critical in navigating the country through this turbulent period, and his efforts to preserve the Union and end the institution of slavery would forever shape the course of American history. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and his subsequent inauguration in 1861 set the stage for one of the most critical and turbulent periods in American history. Just months after his inauguration, the Southern states, which had vehemently opposed his election, began to secede from the Union, citing their desire to preserve the institution of slavery. In December 1860, South Carolina led the way, followed by other Southern states forming the Confederate States of America, CSA. In response to the secession of the Southern states, Lincoln found himself not only in a battle to preserve the Union, but also facing the challenge of dealing with a full-scale rebellion against the federal government. The Civil War, which would rage for 4 years, would be one of the defining tests of Lincoln's leadership, forcing him to confront issues of national unity, human rights, and the survival of American democracy. Lincoln's initial approach to the crisis was one of calm determination and caution. As the Southern states seceded, Lincoln was keenly aware of the precariousness of the Union and the potential for conflict. He made every attempt to reassure the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery in the states where it already existed, and he emphasized his belief in the Constitution as the ultimate safeguard for both Northern and Southern interests. However, Lincoln's refusal to allow slavery to spread into new territories, combined with his belief in preserving the Union at all costs, made compromise increasingly difficult. In his inaugural address, Lincoln articulated a message of unity, declaring that the Union is older than any of the states, and, in fact, it created them as states. Despite this conciliatory rhetoric, the situation quickly escalated as Southern states took increasingly aggressive actions, culminating in the firing on Fort Sumter, a federal fort in South Carolina, in April 1861. The attack on Fort Sumter marked the beginning of the Civil War, and it dramatically shifted the political and military landscape. Lincoln's response was swift and decisive. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, framing the conflict as a struggle to preserve the Union rather than a war over slavery. This decision was pivotal in rallying the North, where many were still ambivalent about the abolition of slavery, but were united in their desire to maintain the Union. Lincoln's ability to frame the war as a battle to preserve the nation's unity rather than solely a moral crusade against slavery enabled him to maintain broad support, even as the war grew more complex and casualties mounted. From the outset of the war, Lincoln displayed a keen understanding of the military and political realities facing the Union. He recognized that the Confederacy was determined to establish its independence and that the war would not be over quickly or easily. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lincoln had little formal military experience, yet he quickly grasped the importance of leadership and strategy. He made the decision to take an active role in military decision-making, sometimes counteracting the advice of his generals when he believed it necessary. This hands-on approach was sometimes criticized, but it allowed Lincoln to maintain a sense of control over the direction of the war and to ensure that the Union remained united in its efforts. In addition to his military leadership, Lincoln faced the challenge of maintaining political unity at home. The war created deep divisions within the country, and the administration had to contend with widespread dissent, especially in the northern states, where anti-war sentiment and calls for peace negotiations were growing. Lincoln's ability to navigate these divisions was a testament to his political skill. He deftly handled dissent within his own party and was able to keep the support of key political figures, including those who were initially critical of his leadership. Throughout the war, Lincoln was able to maintain a delicate balance between enforcing military discipline and preserving democratic principles. His leadership during this time was characterized by his willingness to make difficult decisions for the greater good, even when they were unpopular or controversial. One of the most significant and transformative actions taken by Lincoln during the war was the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. While the war had initially been framed as a struggle to preserve the Union, Lincoln's personal abhorrence of slavery began to shape his policy decisions more directly as the conflict progressed. The Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territories were to be freed, was both a moral and strategic move. It was morally significant because it took a bold stand against the institution of slavery, which had long been a source of division within the country. Strategically, it weakened the Confederacy by depriving it of its labor force and by giving the Union a moral cause that galvanized Northern support. The Emancipation Proclamation was not an immediate end to slavery, as it applied only to the states in rebellion and did not affect slavery in the border states or in areas under Union control. However, its impact was profound. It shifted the focus of the war from mere preservation of the Union to a war for human freedom. It also paved the way for the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. The proclamation was a defining moment in Lincoln's presidency, marking the point at which he fully embraced the moral imperative of ending slavery, even at the cost of alienating some Northern factions and prolonging the war. Lincoln's political vision extended beyond the immediate goal of winning the war and preserving the Union. He was deeply concerned with how the country would be rebuilt after the conflict was over. His vision for Reconstruction, the process of reintegrating the Southern states into the Union and rebuilding the nation, was marked by a belief in mercy and reconciliation. Lincoln was determined to heal the wounds of war and to provide a path for the Southern states to rejoin the Union without punitive measures. His approach to Reconstruction was characterized by the famous 10% Plan, which offered amnesty and the restoration of political rights to Southerners who swore an oath of allegiance to the Union, provided that 10% of the state's voters took the same oath. This plan was seen by many as overly lenient, but Lincoln's goal was to bring about a lasting peace, one that would not leave the South embittered or divided. Despite Lincoln's efforts to negotiate a peaceful end to the war, the conflict dragged on and the death toll continued to rise. Lincoln's leadership was increasingly tested as he faced the enormous burden of managing the war effort and maintaining morale both in the North and within his own government. The war's toll on soldiers, families, and civilians was immense, and the pressures of leadership often took a personal toll on Lincoln himself. His physical appearance became noticeably gaunt, and he was known to experience frequent bouts of depression. Yet he remained focused on his ultimate goal, preserving the Union and securing a future of freedom for all Americans. By the time the war reached its final stages, with the Confederacy on the brink of collapse, Lincoln had become a symbol of national resolve. His second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865, encapsulated his vision for the future of the nation. Lincoln spoke of malice toward none and charity for all, emphasizing the need for national reconciliation and healing. His words were a stark contrast to the rhetoric of punishment and revenge that was being advocated by some in the North. Lincoln's vision for the post-war nation was one of unity, where the scars of war could be healed through forgiveness and understanding. Unfortunately, Lincoln would not live to see the fruits of his vision for Reconstruction. On April 14, 1865, just days after the Confederacy's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. His death was a devastating blow to the nation, and it left the future of Reconstruction in question. However, Lincoln's leadership during the war had secured his place as one of the greatest American presidents. His resolve, his moral vision, and his unwavering commitment to the Union transformed the United States and ensured that it would emerge from the Civil War as a stronger, more unified nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was one of the most pivotal moments in American history. In the midst of the Civil War, a conflict that was as much about the preservation of the Union as it was about the future of slavery, Lincoln's proclamation would forever change the course of the nation. While the document did not immediately free all enslaved people, it was a significant step toward the abolition of slavery in the United States. The proclamation reflected Lincoln's evolving views on slavery and underscored his deepening commitment to ending the institution that had divided the country for so long. The Emancipation Proclamation was the product of a long process of political calculation, moral conviction, and military strategy. When Lincoln first assumed the presidency in 1861, his primary goal was to preserve the Union. He was cautious about the issue of slavery, fearing that any radical moves against it would alienate the southern states and make reconciliation impossible. Initially, Lincoln sought to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories, but he was careful not to threaten slavery where it already existed. However, as the war progressed, it became increasingly clear that slavery was central to the Southern economy and the Confederacy's war effort. It was not enough to simply stop the expansion of slavery. It had to be abolished in order to ensure the Union's victory. The process that led to the Emancipation Proclamation was shaped by a combination of military necessity and moral imperative. In the early years of the war, Lincoln hesitated to act decisively on slavery, fearing it would fracture Northern support for the war effort. However, as Union military victories remained elusive and the war dragged on, Lincoln began to see the abolition of slavery as a key to weakening the Confederate cause. In addition to its moral dimensions, slavery was an economic and strategic resource for the South, with enslaved people providing labor for agricultural production and fortifying the Confederate military. By undermining the Confederacy's ability to utilize slave labor, Lincoln hoped to hasten the end of the war. Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation was also influenced by the evolving public opinion in the North. By 1862, the anti-slavery movement had gained significant momentum. Abolitionist groups, such as the American Anti-Slavery Society, had long advocated for the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people, but they were not always in alignment with the political realities of the Union. Lincoln understood the importance of balancing moral principles with political pragmatism. In his famous House Divided speech, Lincoln had argued that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. As the war continued, the moral and political urgency of emancipation became clearer. When Lincoln announced his intention to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, he framed it as a wartime measure designed to weaken the Confederacy. He made it clear that he would not free enslaved people in the border states or in areas of the South under Union control, as he feared this would alienate the loyal slave states and exacerbate the divisions within the Union. The proclamation was specifically aimed at those Confederate states that were still in rebellion. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were to be freed, effective January 1st, 1863. The immediate effect of the Emancipation Proclamation was limited, as it applied only to Confederate territories that were beyond the control of the Union Army. It did not free enslaved people in Union-controlled territories, such as the border states or areas already under federal occupation. However, its significance was immense. The proclamation gave the Union war effort a moral cause, transforming the conflict from a struggle to preserve the Union into a war for human freedom. It also had profound political implications. making it clear that slavery would not be allowed to continue as an institution in any form in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation also had a direct impact on the lives of enslaved people in the South. While it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, it galvanized enslaved people in Confederate-held areas to escape to Union lines. As the Union Army advanced through the South, enslaved people took advantage of the opportunity to flee, and many joined the Union Army. By the end of the war, approximately 200,000 African American soldiers and sailors had served in the Union military, many of them former slaves. The emancipation policy not only disrupted the Confederate labor force, but also empowered enslaved people to actively fight for their freedom. In addition to its military and strategic implications, the Emancipation Proclamation had far-reaching social and cultural consequences. For African Americans in the North and in the Union-controlled territories, the proclamation was a symbol of hope and progress. It marked a shift from the passive resistance that many African Americans had practiced in the antebellum period to active participation in the struggle for freedom. For enslaved people in the South, the proclamation represented a tangible step toward the realization of their long-held aspirations for liberation. The Emancipation Proclamation became a rallying cry for freedom and justice, fueling the abolitionist movement and inspiring future generations of activists. The aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation was complex and, at times, controversial. While it had a profound impact on the course of the war and on the institution of slavery, it did not lead to immediate and widespread emancipation. Enslaved people in Confederate territories did not experience freedom until Union forces arrived in their areas, and the full abolition of slavery would not come until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Nevertheless, the proclamation represented a significant shift in the war's objectives, making it clear that the preservation of the Union was inextricably linked to the abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also faced criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Some abolitionists felt that it did not go far enough, arguing that Lincoln should have immediately freed all enslaved people and made emancipation a central goal of the war. They believed that the proclamation, while a step in the right direction, was too cautious and lacked the boldness necessary to end slavery once and for all. On the other hand, some Northern Democrats and conservative factions believed that the Emancipation Proclamation was an overreach of presidential power and a threat to the nation's stability. They feared that the abolition of slavery would provoke more divisions within the Union and lead to the collapse of the economy in the South. Despite the controversy and limitations of the Emancipation Proclamation, its legacy is undeniable. It reshaped the moral and political landscape of the war, giving the Union a clear purpose in its fight against the Confederacy. By the time the war ended in 1865, slavery had been abolished in the United States, and the Emancipation Proclamation had set the stage for the 13th Amendment, which formally ended the institution of slavery. Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation demonstrated his courage and political foresight as he placed the moral imperative of ending slavery above political expediency. Abraham Lincoln's second term as president, which began in March 1865, was marked by the impending conclusion of the Civil War and the challenging task of rebuilding the nation. The war, which had claimed the lives of over 600,000 soldiers and civilians, was in its final stages. The Confederacy was collapsing, and the Union forces, under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant, had achieved a series of decisive victories. However, Lincoln's second term was not one of relief or triumph. Instead, it was a time of profound national reckoning, as the country had to come to terms with the immense costs of the war and the complex questions of Reconstruction and reconciliation. One of the most notable aspects of Lincoln's second term was the sense of urgency that accompanied the final months of the war. Lincoln knew that the Confederacy's defeat was imminent, but he was also aware that the process of reunifying the nation and ensuring lasting peace would require careful attention and leadership. His overarching goal was to preserve the Union and, in doing so, to ensure that the country emerged from the war stronger and more united than ever before. The challenges of rebuilding the nation, however, were compounded by the enormous divisions that had existed between the North and South, as well as the deep-seated racial tensions that had been exacerbated by the war. One of the key issues that defined Lincoln's second term was the question of how to bring the Southern states back into the Union. Lincoln had long advocated for a lenient approach to Reconstruction, believing that reconciliation and forgiveness were essential for healing the wounds of the war. His approach to the post-war South was encapsulated in his 10% plan, which offered amnesty and the restoration of political rights to Southerners who swore an oath of loyalty to the Union, provided that 10% of the state's voters took the same oath. Lincoln's policy was predicated on the belief that a swift and generous peace would prevent the South from becoming a bitter, divided region. Despite Lincoln's vision of a lenient Reconstruction, political opposition within both the North and the South remained strong. Radical Republicans in Congress, such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, believed that Lincoln's approach was too lenient. They argued that the South should be punished for its role in the rebellion, and that the rights of freed slaves should be fully protected. These radical Republicans pushed for more stringent measures, including the passage of the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864, which required a majority of white males in a Southern state to take an oath of allegiance before the state could be readmitted into the Union. Lincoln vetoed the bill, as he believed it would only serve to prolong the conflict and make reconciliation more difficult. The differences between Lincoln's lenient approach and the radical Republicans' more punitive vision of Reconstruction were evident, but Lincoln's approach had a certain pragmatism to it. He understood that the Southern states would have to be reintegrated into the Union, and he was committed to doing so in a way that would avoid further alienation or resentment. At the same time, Lincoln recognized that the newly freed African American population would need support and protection in the post-war South. This led to the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States and ensured that the government would take an active role in ensuring the rights of former slaves. In addition to his efforts to shape the future of the South, Lincoln faced significant challenges on the military front during the final months of the war. While Union victories were becoming more frequent, the Confederacy's military leaders, such as General Robert E. Lee, continued to mount fierce resistance. Lincoln's role as commander-in-chief was crucial in maintaining the momentum of the Union war effort. He worked closely with General Grant and other Union commanders to plan and execute military strategies, often offering direct guidance and insight into the direction of the war. One of the defining features of Lincoln's second term was his ability to maintain political unity within the Union. The war had created deep divisions in the North, with many factions advocating for peace and an immediate end to hostilities. Lincoln faced significant opposition from the Copperheads, a group of Northern Democrats who sought a negotiated peace with the South. In his second term, Lincoln had to contend with not only the Confederate threat, but also the political factions within his own party that sought to undermine his leadership. Despite these challenges, Lincoln remained committed to the preservation of the Union and the end of slavery. As the war came to an end, Lincoln's leadership became more focused on the future of the nation. He recognized that the end of the war would not be the end of the nation's struggles. The Southern states would need to be reintegrated, and the newly freed slaves would need to be incorporated into the social, economic, and political fabric of the country. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was one of healing, where former enemies could come together and work toward a shared future. He viewed the process of reintegration as essential for the survival of the Union, and he believed that a spirit of reconciliation would be the key to overcoming the trauma of the war. Lincoln's second term was also marked by his continued efforts to promote the passage of the 13th Amendment. The amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States, was a critical piece of legislation that Lincoln considered essential for securing the nation's future. While the Emancipation Proclamation had set the stage for the end of slavery, Lincoln knew that a constitutional amendment was necessary to ensure that slavery would never be reinstated. The passage of the 13th Amendment in January 1865 was one of the greatest achievements of Lincoln's presidency and a testament to his commitment to justice and equality. Throughout the final months of his presidency, Lincoln remained focused on the challenges that lay ahead. The war was nearing its end, but the nation's future was uncertain. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction, while conciliatory and forward-thinking, was met with both hope and skepticism. He understood that the path to reconciliation would be long and difficult, but he was resolute in his belief that the country could heal and move forward together. His second term was defined by his efforts to create a lasting peace, to abolish slavery, and to build a stronger, more united nation. Tragically, Lincoln did not live to see the full realization of his vision for Reconstruction. On April 14, 1865, just days after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. His death was a devastating blow to the nation, as it robbed the country of its leader at a time when his guidance was needed most. The future of Reconstruction would now fall to his successor, Andrew Johnson, whose approach to the South was far less lenient and more contentious than Lincoln's. Johnson's policies would eventually lead to a period of political turmoil and racial strife that would shape the post-war era. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, shocked the nation to its core, marking a tragic and defining moment in American history. Lincoln's death, occurring just days after the Confederacy's formal surrender, left the nation in mourning, and it abruptly ended the leadership of a president who had guided the country through its most devastating conflict. His assassination not only marked a personal tragedy for the nation, but also set the stage for the tumultuous period of Reconstruction that would follow. In the wake of his death, the United States was forced to reckon with the loss of its most revered leader and the uncertainty of the post-war era. Lincoln's assassination occurred at a time when the Union had achieved victory in the Civil War, but the country was still deeply divided. The war had ravaged the South, left the North mourning the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers, and created a fragile peace that could have easily crumbled in the face of inadequate leadership. Lincoln had envisioned a process of reconciliation and reconstruction that would allow the Southern states to return to the Union with dignity and forgiveness. His leadership had provided a sense of hope for a nation in turmoil, and his assassination left a profound sense of loss and uncertainty for the future. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a Confederate sympathizer who believed that killing Lincoln would help resurrect the Confederacy and exact revenge for the South's defeat. Booth had carefully planned the assassination, hoping to disrupt the Union's political leadership and plunge the nation back into chaos. On the evening of April 14, 1865, while Lincoln was attending a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln was immediately gravely injured, and despite the best efforts of his doctors, he died the following day on April 15, 1865. The immediate reaction to Lincoln's assassination was one of disbelief and shock. News of the president's death spread quickly across the nation, and people reacted with a mix of grief, horror, and anger. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was one of profound sorrow, with government officials and citizens alike struggling to comprehend the loss. For many, Lincoln's death felt like the loss of the nation's moral compass, as he had become synonymous with the Union cause and the fight for freedom. His leadership had seen the country through its darkest days, and his sudden death left a deep void. Lincoln's assassination also highlighted the deep political divisions within the country. While the North mourned the loss of its leader, the South, which had been defeated in the Civil War, found itself grappling with the consequences of its own actions. Booth's assassination was an act of political violence that aimed to disrupt the peace process and embolden the South to continue its fight for independence. However, the murder of Lincoln did not rally the South in any meaningful way. Instead, it ensured that any hope for a peaceful reconciliation would be delayed, as the country was thrust into a period of uncertainty and instability. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson ascended to the presidency. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, was an unexpected choice to lead the nation. His views on Reconstruction were far more lenient than those of the radical Republicans in Congress, and he was not seen as the unifying figure that Lincoln had been. Johnson's presidency would be marked by contentious political battles over how to rebuild the South and the status of newly freed African Americans. The assassination of Lincoln, in many ways, sealed the fate of Reconstruction, as Johnson's approach led to further political divisions and conflict with Congress. The national response to Lincoln's death was also deeply personal for many Americans. Throughout the country, people held memorial services and public displays of mourning became widespread. Cities across the North held funeral processions, and the government ordered a national period of mourning. Thousands of people lined the streets in Washington, D.C. to pay their respects, and Lincoln's body was transported by train to Springfield, Illinois, where he was interred in a tomb in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The funeral procession became a symbolic moment for the nation, as it marked the passing of a man who had been a beacon of hope and unity during the darkest period in American history. The funeral of Abraham Lincoln, however, was not only a moment of national mourning, but also a symbolic moment of reflection on the country's journey. Lincoln had presided over the most difficult chapter in the nation's history, and his death forced Americans to confront the questions of how to rebuild and move forward. His leadership had been characterized by a commitment to preserving the Union and ending slavery, but his death raised the question of whether his vision for a just and unified nation could survive without him at the helm. While Lincoln's assassination had immediate political ramifications, it also had profound cultural implications. His death solidified his status as a martyr and symbol of freedom and justice. In the years following his assassination, Lincoln would be memorialized in countless speeches, writings, and monuments. His legacy would grow larger in the collective memory of the nation, as his commitment to equality and unity became a touchstone for future generations. His words, such as those in the Gettysburg Address, would be quoted and revered, shaping the national identity for generations to come. The aftermath of Lincoln's assassination also marked the beginning of a period of political and social upheaval in the United States. Reconstruction, which Lincoln had envisioned as a process of healing and reconciliation, would become a contentious and divisive process under Johnson's leadership. The Southern states were slowly reintegrated into the Union, but the promises of freedom and equality for African Americans would be undermined by a series of racist policies and violent backlash. Johnson's failure to effectively lead the nation through this critical period would lead to his impeachment and the eventual rise of more radical policies aimed at protecting the rights of freed slaves. In addition to the political consequences, Lincoln's assassination also catalyzed the movement for civil rights and the abolition of slavery. Though Lincoln himself did not live to see the full realization of his vision for racial equality, his leadership laid the groundwork for the abolitionist movement and the eventual civil rights struggles that would define the 20th century. His death served as a tragic reminder of the sacrifices that had been made for the cause of freedom, and his memory would inspire future leaders and activists in the fight for equality and justice. The legacy of Abraham Lincoln is one of the most profound and enduring in American history. His leadership during the Civil War, his commitment to the abolition of slavery, and his vision for a united democratic nation have left an indelible mark on the United States. While his presidency was marred by the deep divisions and strife of the Civil War, Lincoln's vision and values continue to shape the nation to this day. His legacy is not merely a collection of political achievements, but also a testament to his moral fortitude and the ideals he upheld: justice, liberty, and equality. Lincoln's death, though tragic, cemented his status as a martyr for the cause of freedom, and his impact on American society and the world remains monumental. Lincoln's greatest legacy lies in his role as the leader who preserved the Union and, in doing so, transformed the United States. The Civil War, which tore the nation apart, could have led to permanent disunion. The prospect of two separate nations, one based on slavery and the other on freedom, was a devastating possibility. However, through his leadership, Lincoln was able to steer the Union toward victory and ensure that the United States remained one nation. His unwavering commitment to the preservation of the Union was not just a political goal, but a moral one, rooted in his belief in the principles of democracy and the idea that all men were created equal. Lincoln's actions during the war, from his decisions to issue the Emancipation Proclamation to his leadership at Gettysburg, were a reflection of his deep understanding of the nation's purpose and destiny. Another central aspect of Lincoln's legacy is his role in the abolition of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, was one of the most significant executive actions in American history. It declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free, and while it did not immediately end slavery, it altered the course of the war by making the abolition of slavery a central goal of the Union war effort. Lincoln's leadership in this area was both practical and moral. He understood that the end of slavery was essential not only for the survival of the Union, but also for the moral and ethical future of the nation. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, was the culmination of Lincoln's vision and one of his greatest achievements. By eliminating slavery, Lincoln ensured that the nation could no longer be defined by its history of human bondage and created the foundation for the struggle for civil rights that would follow. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was another crucial element of his legacy. Though he did not live to see the full realization of his plans, his approach to post-war reconciliation was marked by a desire to heal the nation's wounds. Lincoln believed that the Southern states should be reintegrated into the Union quickly and with generosity, rather than subjected to punishment. His 10% plan, which offered amnesty to Southerners who swore an oath of loyalty to the Union, exemplified his belief in reconciliation over retribution. Unfortunately, Lincoln's assassination left the execution of his vision in the hands of his successor, Andrew Johnson, whose policies would not carry the same spirit of forgiveness and understanding. Despite this, Lincoln's commitment to unity remains a defining characteristic of his legacy. He understood that the strength of the United States lay not in its ability to punish the South, but in its ability to overcome division and work together for the common good. Beyond his political and legislative accomplishments, Lincoln's legacy is defined by the moral clarity he brought to the office of the presidency. In an era when political expediency often trumped ethical concerns, Lincoln maintained an unwavering commitment to the principles of justice and equality. His speeches, such as the Gettysburg Address, where he famously declared that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, have become central texts in American political thought. Lincoln's ability to speak to the nation's higher ideals, even in the midst of war, set him apart as a leader of extraordinary vision and character. One of the most significant aspects of Lincoln's legacy is his role in shaping the American political landscape. His presidency marked the transition of the United States from a nation where slavery was entrenched to one committed, at least in principle, to liberty and equality for all. The Civil War and its aftermath would reshape the political and social fabric of the nation, leading to the expansion of federal power, the rise of the Republican Party as a dominant political force, and the eventual passage of civil rights legislation. Lincoln's role in establishing a more robust federal government, which would play a key role in the protection of civil rights, marked a turning point in the development of the American state. His vision of a strong, united nation that could uphold democratic principles would influence political leaders for generations to come. Additionally, Lincoln's legacy is also deeply tied to the abolitionist movement and the broader struggle for civil rights. While Lincoln did not live to see the full expansion of civil rights in America, his leadership laid the groundwork for future efforts to secure equality for all Americans. The abolition of slavery was a necessary first step, but the long journey toward full civil rights for African Americans would continue through the Reconstruction era and into the 20th century. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s would draw on the principles Lincoln established, framing their struggles in terms of the vision of equality that he had advanced. Lincoln's ability to navigate the deep political divisions of his time also solidified his place as a model of leadership. His willingness to confront opposition within his own party, as well as the persistence with which he pursued his goals, showed a deep understanding of the necessity of compromise and unity. His ability to keep the Union intact during a time of unprecedented division demonstrated not only political acumen, but also moral courage. Lincoln was a president who understood the importance of balancing idealism with pragmatism, and his ability to make difficult decisions, such as choosing military commanders and handling the political fallout from the Emancipation Proclamation, solidified his reputation as a leader who could navigate crises with wisdom and resolve. Lincoln's death only furthered the mythic stature that he would come to hold in the nation's history. His assassination elevated him to martyrdom, with his death becoming a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice for the Union and the cause of freedom. His legacy as a martyr for liberty and equality helped to solidify his place in the American pantheon of great leaders. The nation mourned his loss, but in doing so, it also affirmed the ideals for which he had stood. His memory would continue to inspire future generations, and his leadership would serve as a model for those who sought to overcome division and fight for justice. In the years following his death, Lincoln's legacy would be further enshrined through monuments, biographies, and memorials. His image would become iconic, and his ideas about freedom, equality, and democracy would continue to resonate with Americans from all walks of life. From the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922 to the ongoing study of his speeches and policies, Lincoln's legacy has remained a constant touchstone for American political and social thought. The legacy of Abraham Lincoln is multifaceted and enduring. He was not only the leader who preserved the Union and abolished slavery, but also a figure whose moral vision and political leadership shaped the future of the United States. Lincoln's commitment to the principles of democracy, equality, and justice has continued to inspire Americans and people around the world. His ability to navigate the complexities of war, politics, and social change, while maintaining his ethical vision, has ensured that his place in history remains secure. As a leader who sought to reconcile a divided nation and bring freedom to the oppressed, Abraham Lincoln's legacy endures as one of the most significant in the history of the United States. His contributions to the nation continue to be felt, and his example remains a guiding light for those who aspire to lead with courage, conviction, and moral clarity.